So, what I really want you to know about all these ways of knowing, these multiple intelligences, these learning styles, um, is just awareness for your methods. When you're designing a training, it's good to know, hey, not everybody in this room is going to learn like me. Some people will best learn that way or another way. I'm a visual learner, but I'm going to have a lot of auditory learners and some tactile learners. I have a lot of linguistic intelligence, or I have a strength there, but I'm going to have a lot of kinesthetic people. So it's important to remember that when you're kind of deciding what will I do in the class. However, you cannot dictate what you will design based on a certain type of learning style. For instance, if there's somebody, and this is kind of a off-the-cuff example, but if I'm trying to teach intercultural training to somebody with musical intelligence or strengths, or a tactile sort of understanding, or a kinesthetic intelligence, it's going to be difficult for me to design something that meets them where they best learn, or their favorite type of learning. There's some natural ways that I can teach this. Now, I can actually come up with some different ways. So say I do have a lot of people with a strong musical intelligence, perhaps I can bring in some different types of music from different cultures, and we can look at what's cultural about that music. How do they change? What does that say about a culture? Can we interpret that? So you can create some things, but at the end of the day, you have to design the training based on what you want people to be able to know, do, or feel. And you're limited in terms of what you can do. So do not think that any of these ways of knowing or multiple intelligences are going to frame exactly what you're going to design. You cannot possibly design a training that is going to meet each person with different intelligences and different learning styles exactly where they are for all times. A strategy that I use to acknowledge that we have all sorts of different learners is to try to find a mixture of different ways of getting a point across. So not just one exercise in dialectics, but how can we have a conversation about dialectics? How can I put something on the board and have people come and participate in it and mark themselves on the spectrum and have a follow-up discussion, so that there's multiple ways that people can kind of connect to what we're trying to cover, or what our outcome is. So that is really the keys for this piece of it. Just don't think that you now have to be sort of a slave to all of these intelligences and ways of knowing. Just know what they are, consider them, think about how you can offer some different ways. Don't design trainings that just you will love, but think about different types of people and different types of learners. So, with that, I briefly wanted to share an example that is in the Harvard Educational Review, the indigenous knowledge and the story of the bean. So what is really key in this reading, and I apologize that I wasn't able to get it in the e-reserve, it's a narrative about this woman who is an assistant teacher, and she's a teacher in training. And they show her the basic experiment that we probably all did in elementary school, where we learn how plants grow. And you plant a seed in sand, and you plant a seed in soil, and you plant a seed in rocks, and you see how they do. And then, one plant does well, one plant doesn't grow at all, one plant starts and then dies, just to kind of understand what plants need to grow, right? And then you have to measure it with a ruler. It's just one of those classic elementary science experiments. So there's one particular teaching assistant who was coming up through the system, who was asked how she would teach this differently. And this woman was from an indigenous culture. And so she said in her community, she'd do a lot of things differently. Firstly, she would take the seeds that they had and they would all look at them and understand what the different types of seeds were. So they'd look at a pumpkin seed and a corn kernel, all these different seeds. And the instructor was like, well, why would you bother doing that before you just planted them? And she's like, well, you wouldn't just plant any seed. You have to plant it at the right time. You have to plant it when you know what you want. If you want a pumpkin, you don't want to plant a corn kernel. And there's no sense wasting seeds. And then she said, and then I wouldn't plant it in sand or in rocks because it doesn't grow in sand and rocks, and everyone knows that. What's the point of wasting a seed that way? We would just grow it in soil, and we wouldn't grow it in a cup because what's the point? It won't grow large enough in a cup. We would plant it in a field, or we would plant it where it would best grow, and we'd have to take a field trip to see it grow. And she goes on and on and on with all these ways that they do it differently. She wouldn't bother measuring it with a ruler because you can see it growing. You know that it's getting bigger. There's not really a reason for measuring it with a ruler. And then she says at the end, well, because of all of the tests that we have to take, or all the state tests that kids have to take, I'd show them how to use the ruler and all that sort of thing. But I would go through, she described a very organic or indigenous perspective in growing seeds and why you grow seeds and how you grow seeds. And it just had a what I see as a richer way of teaching this lesson of how things grow and why you grow things. That's much more applicable than, the traditional styrofoam cup. Growing seeds and different types of things to see if they'll grow. So, again, apologies that reading isn't out there, but that's the gist of what it is. And I share it with you just because I think it's always important to think of the context of your learners, and you have a lot of different contexts. But just remember that our traditional way of doing things doesn't always necessarily make the most sense, right? In higher ed, for years and years and years, and even, I'm sorry to say, in this class, we're doing a lot of lecturing weekly, although ours is really more based on discussion, I would say, than the actual lecture. But that's still the most traditional way of teaching and learning, is to have students sitting in a seat for a certain amount of time and having a professor in the front of the class giving a lecture. And it's been very difficult to get teachers to start thinking about experiential ways of knowing, or even different cultural ways of knowing and learning, as described in this indigenous knowledge and the story of the bean. So that's an example that I just share with you. I've given you a lot of stuff this week, and hopefully I've started to help you bring it all together, but I'm hoping that we can continue to do that in our discussions, and I'll be there to kind of jump in if we're off track, or if we need some further guidance as we discuss how we can use all of these things in identifying different learning. Okay, so let's have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you online.